Pushkin. Hi, everyone. This is Lidia Jean Kott, back with another special bonus episode of the Chinatown Sting. Earlier in this season, we heard about how U.S. immigration laws helped create Chinatowns, especially a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882. This act banned Chinese workers from entering the country, and it prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens. And it wasn't until 1965 that immigration quotas based on ethnicity were finally banned, and Chinatowns truly became bustling family neighborhoods. I can't think of anyone better to talk with about this history than Judge Denny Chin. Not only did he and his family live through this history, he now teaches it to law students and lawyers. Judge Denny Chin sits on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, a court that's right below the Supreme Court. Over the course of his career, Judge Chin has overseen many high-profile trials, including the 2009 trial against financial fraudster Bernie Madoff. He's taught courses on Asian American legal history at Fordham University, Harvard, and Yale. And he's the co-author of a forthcoming textbook called Asian Americans and the Law. In addition to all of this, as you'll hear, Judge Chin has also written and performed a series of reenactments of historic cases involving Asian American litigants. I talked to him about how those litigants have shaped American law and challenged the status quo. We met in his chambers at the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse in Lower Manhattan.
And we are actually sitting in chambers once occupied by Thurgood Marshall himself. When he was a judge on our court in the 60s, he actually sat in these very chambers. And it is an incredible honor for me to be sitting where the great Thurgood Marshall himself once sat.
Judge Chin was born in Hong Kong. In 1956, when he was 2 years old, his family moved to New York City. When they arrived, they reunited with his grandfather, who had already been living in Manhattan's Chinatown for decades.
My grandfather lived in one of those railroad apartments on Bayard Street. And in each room, there would be a single man without his family, but they were sharing the apartment. And my grandfather, like the others, each month, he would send a money order home to his family in Hong Kong or China. He actually came to this country illegally in 1916. Back then, there were Chinese exclusion laws on the books, and you could not come into this country at all if you were Chinese, unless you were the son of a U.S. citizen. You may have heard the term paper sons. My grandfather was a paper son. He bought a piece of paper pretending to be the son of a U.S. citizen, and that's how he was admitted to this country. And he worked as a waiter in Chinese restaurants. He went back to China only 2 times. First, in the 1920s when he got married. Second, in the 1930s when my father was born. And both times he had to leave his family behind because of the immigration laws. But in 1947, he became a U.S. citizen. And actually on that wall there, I have his naturalization certificate.
Oh, wow.
And he was...
That's incredible.
Yeah, and I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe he was sworn in as a U.S. citizen in this courthouse, in this building. On the back of it, it says sworn to an open court. In 1947, there was only one courthouse, and this is it. And because he became a citizen and because the immigration laws were finally relaxed, he was able to bring us here in 1956. My father, my mother, my older sister, and my younger brother. We came in 56, and there was a law passed in 1953 called the Refugee Relief Act. And it was intended to help people fleeing from communism. And
I see.
My parents fled China, wound up in Hong Kong where they met and fell in love. And we were admitted under that statute. So we were actually political refugees. And when I was a district judge, and occasionally now even as a circuit judge, I've been able to do the naturalization ceremony to swear in new American citizens. And I take that certificate off the wall, frame and all, and I show it to them. And I tell them the story of my grandfather and my parents.
Wow, that's really moving. And your mom was a garment worker, I imagine?
My mother initially, when we were young, she made jewelry at home. She would be paid by the piece. And then eventually she became a seamstress in Chinatown garment factories. And my father was a cook in Chinese restaurants. They both my mother spoke virtually no English. My father learned a bit.
Do you have memories of, as a kid, like visiting Chinatown, like what Chinatown was like, and the garment factories and such?
Chinatown was certainly a center of life for both my parents. I do have memories, like many Chinese and other Asian families, we went to language school. My sister and I went to Chinatown every day. After regular school, we'd get on the subway, go down to Chinatown, and take Chinese lessons. We did that for a while every day.
Cantonese?
Yeah, we spoke Toisanese originally, but this would have been Cantonese. And eventually it became once a week. But I remember Chinatown then. My grandfather eventually retired, but he would hang out in a hardware store in Chinatown.
Like he'd just hang out there, like chatting away with the other older guys.
Exactly. and in fact, when I was at Princeton, I did my senior thesis called The Old Ones of Chinatown. And it was on the Chinatown senior citizens. And I took some photos. I did some interviewing of people who ran different facilities and services in Chinatown. I enjoyed doing my thesis, but I wound up going to law school, largely because I didn't know what to do with myself at the time.
What did you like about the law when you went into law school?
Well, I went to law school unsure of whether I would become a lawyer. I had never met a lawyer, certainly not a judge as I was growing up. My parents must have had lawyers to help them with the process of becoming naturalized, but I never met any. And went to Fordham Law School. That first summer, I got an internship with a judge in this courthouse. I saw some trials. I remember a bank robbery trial. The judge let me draft some opinions, which were then edited by a law clerk. Being at the center of the administration of justice was something I very much enjoyed. And I decided that summer that I wanted to come back one day and be a judge in the courthouse. And then, of course, many years later, here I am again, right on the edge of Chinatown.
Exactly.
As a federal judge. At one point, when I was a district judge in the other building, and right across the street from the other courthouse is Columbus Park. We played basketball there once a week at 7:30 in the morning. We'd have a pickup game. We'd have prosecutors, law clerks, a variety of people. In New York City playground basketball, there was one full court, and we wanted to run full court. But there were senior citizens doing Tai Chi. There were other community folks, and there was a little bit of competitiveness. However, I started getting a lot of attention with the Madoff case and getting nominated to the circuit. And the Chinatown newspapers would cover this. And at some point, the folks realized who I was. And then they started offering me tea and cookies in the morning and letting us have the full court. And that's why.
After the break, how Judge Chin began writing and performing reenactments of famous cases brought by Asian Americans. I'm back with Judge Denny Chin. A while back, he and his wife, Kathy Harada Chin, started writing and staging reenactments of famous cases involving Asian American litigants. They perform one every year at the National Asian Pacific Bar Association in New York. I asked Judge Chin about how exactly these reenactments come together.
We take excerpts from trial transcripts, judges' opinions, briefs, historical newspaper articles. We weave those excerpts in with original narration that Kathy and I write. And then we present these with a cast of lawyers who are would-be actors. Many lawyers, particularly trial lawyers,
part of it is the performance.
Part of it is performing. And so these are performances, but they raise issues that continue to be important. They tell compelling stories about the early Asian Americans. For example, we have a really interesting reenactment about 22 lewd as in Lewd, Chinese women. Allegedly lewd, I should say. They arrived on a boat in San Francisco in the 1880s, and the California authorities wouldn't let them off unless they posted a $500 bond each. $500 was a lot of money back then. Why? Why wouldn't they let them off? Well, they were women traveling alone, and they were Chinese, and they were suspected of being lewd, of being prostitutes. And there was a trial on whether they were prostitutes. And the case went up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And it's a case that is still raising important issues.
How was it decided?
The women won.
Oh, that's good.
Well, that's good. But what happened to them? They probably were being trafficked. They probably were the victims of trafficking. They were represented by a very good lawyer, a former judge. How could they afford to hire such a good lawyer?
The gangs.
It was probably the trafficker or the gangs who wanted to protect their investment. But can a state take matters involving immigration into its own hands when it feels the federal government isn't doing enough? And that was very much an issue a few years ago. Now it's the opposite. Now it's the federal government thinking states are doing too much to interfere with the immigration authorities. But you can see how these legal issues are still important. So how did I get into this? I was a member of something called the Federal Bar Council Inn of Court. And when I joined, each month a team led by a judge would do some kind of presentation. We did the trial of Ethel Rosenberg. And incidentally, I played Mr. Rosenberg because it was the smallest part. And we reenacted the sentencing, and I had the death sentence imposed on me.
Wow.
And it was no fun, even though it was pretend, having the death penalty imposed on me. And it was actually very good for me as a judge. I was a judge by then.
Do you feel like it?
Yeah, I mean, I played the defendant, and I had the lawyers pointing at me and saying I was stupid but not criminal, that kind of thing. And it gave me some appreciation of the difficulties of going through the process.
Wow. In a way, like what you do with those reenactments is like what we're tried to do with this podcast, which is taking the court docs, taking codes from people, taking a legal case, and kind of like reenacting it to try and understand it.
We think of it as courtroom theater.
Yeah.
There's a lot of drama in the courtroom.
Yeah.
But beyond that, there are compelling stories about the people. And then there are important issues that are still important today, whether it's human trafficking or racial violence. Now, because of all these reenactments of the Asian American cases, I developed a real love for Asian American legal history.
Like, what have you found is unique about the Asian American experience and the law? So we're focusing on that in these reenactments.
Well, first of all, even though the numbers of Asian Americans in the early days, the Chinese in the U.S. population was very, very low, there were lots of cases brought, quite a few cases all the way to the Supreme Court. Asian Americans have been at the center of many, many different issues. Immigration, citizenship, violence. There were many massacres, the civil rights cases. Currently, in addition to the pandemic and the anti-Asian violence, affirmative action. And the early litigants were folks of very limited means, women suspected of being prostitutes, cooks, laundrymen. One of the first cases to be studied in con law is the laundryman case. San Francisco passed a law that if you wanted to run a laundry, it had to be in a stone or brick building. You couldn't have it in a wooden building, ostensibly because of the fear of fires. There was an exception. You could apply for an exception so that you could continue to operate your laundry in a wooden building. And 200 Chinese applied for the exception. There were many, many Chinese laundries in San Francisco at the time. Every single one was denied. There were 80 applications by non-Chinese. Everyone but one was granted.
Oh.
The one that was not granted was a woman.
So, yeah.
And so it's, a law can be discriminatory as applied. Even though on its face it appears neutral, it's applied in a way that is discriminatory. So that was a very important ruling that the Supreme Court. So it's very important, not just for the Chinese, but for many.
Yeah.
You can't take a law that is on its face neutral and apply it in a discriminatory way. And it also said that equal protection applies not just to citizens, but to all persons. And even though all of these Chinese laundrymen were not U.S. citizens, they were still entitled to the protection of the U.S. Constitution. So this is a great example. Compelling stories. There were actually 2 laundrymen involved. They had run their laundries for decades in San Francisco. People of limited means, yet they were bringing these really innovative, creative legal theories. These were important rights, and there were benefits not just for them, but for many, many others. And so, doing the reenactments helped me really learn this Asian American legal history. And then at some point, I decided that we needed to have a seminar to teach it. My colleague and I at Fordham Law School in 2017 developed a seminar on Asian Americans and the law. There are now 14 or more law schools using our syllabus, at least as a start, using our reading materials and offering a similar seminar on Asian Americans and the law.
Coming up after the break, Judge Chin and I talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the violence it unleashed. One of the really fun parts of making the season of the Chinatown Sting was getting to record the movie and Broadway musical actor Telly Leong. He's been the voice of the court docs in the series. When he came in, it was just clear that we were in the presence of a talented professional. And we also asked him to record a portion of the original language of the Chinese Exclusion Act that Congress passed in 1882. I brought that recording with me when I interviewed Judge Chin, and I played it for him. Here's that reenactment from Telly Leong.
Any Chinese person found unlawfully within the United States shall be caused to be removed therefrom to the country from whence he came, by direction of the President of the United States, and at the cost of the United States, after being brought before some justice, judge, or commissioner of a court of the United States, and found to be one not lawfully entitled to be or remain in the United States.
And yeah, I guess that's what you think when you hear those words.
Well, it's very moving to hear the words, and that person read them very well. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the subsequent amendments and extensions is a very important part of Asian American legal history. Why was this happening? What was driving Congress to pass this? it's often overlooked that the Chinatowns contributed greatly to the broader American society as well. You know, the trade, shipping goods back to China, bringing goods from China. There were all sorts of taxes imposed on the Chinese, and the Chinese paid. You know, the Chinese contributed. There were massacres of Chinese gold miners, but many of the early Chinese gold miners would come in after a location or a mine had been abandoned by the original miners. And then they would try to like do the leftovers almost, but they would find ways to get more gold out of it. And I don't know. And, you know, originally the Chinese were welcomed. There was more curiosity than anything else. But then in time, these feelings grew. Part of it was political. When Governor Bigler was running for re-election, he seized on the Chinese question.
And he was in California.
He was in California. He was facing re-election, and he used this as a campaign theme. What the Chinese are doing, they're taking our gold, sending it back, etc. You could see efforts being used, politicians and others using these things to rally the masses. In the 1880s, many communities around the country literally drove out all their Chinese residents. The Chinese were expelled from the towns, and one of them was Eureka in California. There were, a Princeton professor has done research on this, there were 168 communities at least that drove out all their Chinese residents.
Like through in the West Coast?
On the West Coast, California, but also further north, Seattle, Bellingham, Washington. It wasn't just the Chinese in Bellingham, it was the South Asians. Many of them were Sikh, although they were called Hindus at the time. And in Eureka, the numbers vary, but it was 200, 300, as many as 800 Chinese were driven out of town.
What was the driving out? How did the driving out work? What was it?
Several hundred people banded together, but including leaders of the community, and physically forced them out and put them on boats and sent them off to San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
Many of them were, where could they go? And many of them wound up heading east. There were some lawsuits brought as a result of Eureka. There was one case where I think it was approximately 51 residents and merchants, Chinese residents and merchants, brought what was essentially a class action.
Were there class actions already back then?
No, there weren't class actions back then. There was no such thing as Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. So this is yet another example of creative, innovative lawyering. They filled out forms and put in their individual details and then put them together into one complaint. And so literally it was like a class action.
Oh, wow.
2 of the 51 who were part of the complaint were women. And one of them in her form put in parentheses, woman. She wanted to tell the court that she was a woman. Now, that case was eventually dismissed.
And they were asking to be able to stay in Eureka?
No, they were asking for money damages. But so these individuals sued for damages. And another creative, innovative aspect about this, they were trying to hold the city of Eureka responsible for failing to control the rioters.
Yeah.
And they were asserting this. It failed, but it sent a message that we're going to fight back, you know. And so there were many instances of the Chinese being driven out of the community. In Seattle, the rioters rounded up the Chinese, brought them down to the wharf. They collected money to pay for their passages on a boat, so that they could be sent off. And they were even willing to put in their own money to do this.
I guess I'm wondering, of course, your students are going to, you know, come away with a lot from the class. But if, like, you know, years down the line when they're remembering their Asian Americans in the law class, if they were to just come away with like one sentence or one memory from that class, what would you want them to like hold on to from the experience?
I think Asian American legal history teaches us a lot about how the Constitution is supposed to work, how sometimes it works, but unfortunately how often it doesn't work. It teaches us that committed, resourceful, courageous people can do a lot to help make things better.
Yeah, having studied, Asian Americans in the law and seeing how, sometimes cases are decided in ways in retrospect that seem wrong, or like how that makes you think about your role as a judge in a system that is quite blatantly from the textbooks imperfect.
Yeah, our system is imperfect, but I think based on 31 years of being a judge, I think we usually get things right. It works pretty well. It is not perfect. Now, studying these cases, there are a couple of things. One is to be creative and think broadly about things. But two is scrutinize things. Don't just blindly defer to the executive branch. During internment, I do not believe the Supreme Court sufficiently put the government to its proof. 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast, right? Military necessity. We don't have time to individually consider whether someone is a danger, a particular Japanese person is a danger in terms of espionage and sabotage. We don't have time to have hearings or individual consideration. And the court just accepted the government at its word instead of pressing back, instead of saying, show us. What are the examples of sabotage? Take away the children. Take away the older people. Take away the women. Women really weren't part of the military then and were less of a threat. 2/3 of the 120,000 were American citizens. When you start looking at it more carefully, did we actually have the time to give them hearings and to look at at least to do an interview of some kind? And instead, the government took months to build assembly centers and then 10 internment camps. So, one lesson is don't just accept the government at its word, put it to its proof. That's appropriate. And I think we're seeing that these days. Many of the lower courts, the trial judges, are making decisions where I think they are indeed requiring the government to support what they are asserting and not just blindly accepting their say-so.
As I said goodbye to Judge Chin, he stood up to find something for me. Something he says he never lets anyone leave his chambers without.
Everyone should have a pocket constitution.
Thank you. I so appreciate Judge Denny Chin taking the time to talk with me. He sits on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and he's the co-author of a forthcoming textbook called Asian Americans and the Law. This episode of the Chinatown Sting was produced by Sonia Gurwit and edited by Julia Barton. It was engineered by Sarah Bruguiere. Our executive producer is Jacob Smith. Our music was composed by John Sung, with additional music by Jake Gorski. All voiceover work by Tally Leong. The Chinatown Sting is a production of Pushkin Industries. To find more Pushkin podcasts, listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Lidia Jean Kott.